The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, oftentimes in this place we refer to industry, or we refer to the labour movement or organized labour when we're discussing policy. And certainly industry, it's an important terminology. We, across this aisle, the aisle here, I think that we come up with policy, or try to come up with policy, that encourages industry to develop, because industry creates jobs for Canadians. And oftentimes when we refer to organized labour or unions, we have to acknowledge that there has been a significant impact of organized labour in the Western world over time in ensuring fairness and equality for workers' treatment. But, for this bill here, I'd like to pause and not talk about industry and not talk about organized labour, but actually talk about workers. And I think that we have to do that because of where we're at in Canada right now. I can't get up in this place, Madam Speaker, and talk about any sort of policy related to workers or the economy without bringing it back to my riding. I cannot go over, I can't stress enough how important it is for everyone in this House to understand that there are over 100,000 people who have been laid off in the energy sector in Alberta, and what that means to the Canadian economy. These aren't just numbers, they're not just statistics on an unemployment. They're people in my riding. They're our brothers and our sisters. They're family members. They're your neighbor. They're people's husband and wives. They're accountants. They're administrative professionals. They're rig hands. They're every single part of the economy. And they pay taxes, Madam Speaker. They try to make ends meet for their kids. And if we're going to talk about organizations that help create jobs or help support workers, we first have to focus on workers themselves. And I think it's important to do that, to reframe this debate today, because this is the first piece of legislation that this government has put out in the House with regard to supporting workers. My colleague that just gave a speech talked about how unions were the voice of the regular working family. I'd like to think that us here, we're also the voice of regular working families. So if we look at the first bill, this is the first piece of legislation that this government has put in place to support workers. What does it do? So we've got 100,000 plus people in Alberta whose severances are running out, and this doesn't even take into consideration the contractors that have been laid off, the ripple effects down through the service industry. There are a lot of people out of work in my riding, and the first piece of legislation that the Government of Canada puts forward with regard to workers does the following. It removes transparency measures for union leaders to report how they're spending their members' union dues, and it removes the secret ballot provision for union formation. So I could spend the duration of my time here talking about that particular issue and its merits. I know that's being debated over and over again, but I've got to tell you, for me to go back to my riding and report in a householder and a town hall meeting, what is the government doing? What is the government's priority for you who is out of work, for you who you're going to be in the next round of layoffs? What's their priority? It's those two things. And that doesn't cut it. Come on. Are you kidding me? That's not going to give somebody's job back. Moreover, instead of this is their first piece of legislation. There's so many things that they could have done for workers, for people, not for industry, not for big labor, but for workers, the people who are actually out of work in my province. They could ensure that we keep taxes low. We know that when we have a low tax system, we see the economy grow because people have more money in their wallet to spend, to make ends meet. We know that companies have more flexibility and freedom to be able to make investments, which create jobs. We could keep taxes low. Are we doing that? No, we're not. We're hearing signals that the government wants to increase taxes on job-creating companies while people are out of work and can't make ends meet. We know that the government has signaled that they want to increase CPP premiums. I don't know about you, but I can certainly tell you right now that does not help somebody who is out of work or is looking for a job. The last thing that they need is more money coming off of their paycheck every week. I certainly am not comfortable going back to them in my riding and telling them that that's what the government's doing and that's a fantastic thing that's going to create jobs. The government has also signaled that they're going to increase EI premiums. What does that do? Why is that important for workers? Because that's, once again, more money off of their paycheck. And for anyone who's running a small business or looking to create jobs in this economy right now, if you have to pay more premiums, do you think that that's going to help facilitate more job creation? No, it's crazy. Anybody who is credible, who has looked at those types of programs in this economy, has said that it's going to put a further chill on the economy. These are the government's actual priorities for people who are out of work in my riding right now. And I think it's worth getting mad about. Furthermore, to rub salt into this wound, they've added a layer of regulatory uncertainty. Now, that's a very unsexy term for saying they've made it more difficult for the energy sector to do business. What the government has signaled is that in recent weeks is that rather than having a clearly defined arm's-length process in which the government relies on a third-party and scientific evidence to make an assessment on a major energy project which does what? Create jobs. And again, this isn't about driving just to a yes. This is about driving to a yes or a no under set parameters that industry know what's happening in a scientific review process so that investments can be made with some level of certainty. What they've said is rather than doing this, they're going to rely on a political process. They're not sure what's going to happen. If it goes through this new process that they're putting in place, they may or may not accept that recommendation. What do you think that does for the average worker, since we're talking about worker here? It means we don't know if these projects are going to start one way or another, even if they meet the parameters that have been laid out by the government. It's a sort of stick your finger in the wind and see which way the popular winds are blowing. That's not a way to create jobs. That's not a way to stand up for workers. That is their priority. I have heard nothing in the government. So the Minister of Labour who tabled this bill as her first priority to quote-unquote protect workers, she has talked nothing about attracting and retaining skilled labour in my province as we go through a major period of unemployment. She hasn't talked about the fact that when our skilled labour has to look to leave because they can't make ends meet in my province, that's going to actually affect investment increase and further job creation down the road. No, she tabled this bill about taking away a secret ballot. That's the priority. That is crazy. I can't understand this. You know, I am standing in this place making this speech. My stepfather is a longtime union member. He's an electrician. My brother-in-law is a union member. He's an electrician. I was in a union member. One of my first jobs was in a union. I've managed in a union situation. I understand what it's like to be a unionized worker, to have family members who are in a unionized environment. At the end of the day, what's important here is about people having jobs. And I have heard absolutely nothing from this government in the past weeks that we've been in Parliament that shows how they are going to help grow this economy. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. And what I find very interesting for me in my personal journey here is the minister that tabled this piece of legislation, the government's top priority for workers, was actually the NDP provincial minister of industry when I was 19 years old in Manitoba and looking where I was going to start my career. That was kind of the beginning of an interesting period for Manitoba. You know, it's amazing how history repeats itself. And if we're talking about who is the voice of the regular working family in Canada, who is the voice of the worker, I hope it's us. And I hope that we can stand up here and realize that sending this message to Canadians, that we're going to put this forward as the government's top priority, when there are so many other things that need to be done in this country right now, for the people who are out of work in my riding, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's crazy. And I will not stand by. I will certainly be a strong voice for my constituents in saying what they've done here is wrong.
Yeah. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Argentin? No. Oh, North Honorable and Peterborough South. Sorry about that.
Thanks. Madam Speaker. My question to my honourable colleague would be, we have people out of work across this country, and our hearts go out to them, their families, and their communities. They're also suffering because people do not have jobs. And one of the things we recognize is that the labour community, the labour movement in this country has been critical to us getting to the point where we're at as employees, as employers, and as companies. It's about protection, it's about safety, it's about a number of things. So I guess my question would be, at what point does my honourable colleague think that this is important? Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, my response to my honourable colleague is this. It's not enough to say that your heart goes out to the people in my riding. Every time the government stands up and puts more regulatory uncertainty into the energy industry, raises CPP premiums, raises EI premiums, raises taxes on businesses, your heart doesn't go out to them. You're doing them a disservice. So what's the point that we stand up for workers? It's having a strong thought about how your economic policy is actually affecting the growth of business. This isn't an exercise, an academic exercise. These are people's lives and people's jobs.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member from Skeena-Balky Valley.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank my friend for her speech. I guess the question I'd have is one of the things that businesses greatly dislike when looking for investment or continuing to invest is uncertainty and conflict. One of the things that we've known increasingly as the participation in the labour markets over the number of years, less in the public sector, certainly a dramatic drop in the private sector, has led to more unrest, has led to more uncertainty as collective agreements are no longer the norm in the private sector and the businesses don't have that ability to go out and make those investments knowing what their labour costs would be. I would also suggest to her, and this perhaps she would like to comment on, is that the amount of uncertainty and conflict created, particularly around the energy sector and resource sector, by the previous government increased that lack of ability for companies to invest. There was so much strife in the degrading of our environmental laws. There was so much conflict between the previous governments and organized labour right across the country, both public and private, that in fact the very low to terrible growth rates that this country had under her government's time in office is a direct reflection of policies in part made at the cabinet level by the previous government. We all look for certainty. We all look to support those working families. One of those ways is to have good collective agreements between workers and the employers who employ them. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
To the people listening at home, my colleague opposite would have you believe his rhetoric, but here are the facts. Canada saw one of the highest levels of GDP growth over recessionary levels. You can look in the budget that we tabled last year and see those figures compared to our peer groups, our peer countries and other G7 countries. And when we talk about regulatory certainty, he makes it seem like Canada is somehow North Korea in terms of environmental assessment. The fact remains that Canada has one of the most stringent, robust, and arm's-length environmental assessment processes for major natural resource projects. They can't quantify that, degradation of the environment. They can't quantify that because it's not there. We actually have one of the strongest assessment frameworks here, but the key that they don't like is they don't like the certainty of it. They want to be able to politically interfere in that process, and that's not right, one way or the other, yes or no. What we need is a process that is stable and certain, and we need government policy that actually supports workers. And that means lower taxes and ensuring that families are thought of rather than just special interest groups, major union bosses, even big CEOs. This is about Canadian families, and I hope that we can come together on that policy somehow, some way in this Parliament.
Yeah.